A president is captured, not arrested, captured, no trial, no negotiation, no warning. On Friday, Nicolás Maduro was smiling in Caracas, shaking hands with China's envoy, talking about brotherhood, about loyalty, about standing together through thick and thin. Hours later, U.S. forces took him. This was not diplomacy. This was a declaration. When Donald Trump seized the leader of Venezuela, the world felt the tremor. But one country felt it more than any other, China. Because this was never just about Maduro or democracy or Venezuela. This was about power, about money, about oil, about who gets to decide the rules. China had invested decades in Venezuela, billions of dollars, strategic trust, an all-weather partner. And in one night, that entire equation was thrown into doubt. If a government can be removed by force, what happens to the debts? The oil, the influence? If you want to understand how fragile today's global order really is, pay attention now. If this kind of analysis sharpens how you see the world, stay with me. Because the real story doesn't start in Caracas. It starts with the system that made this moment inevitable. What happened in Venezuela feels sudden, but it wasn't random. This moment sits at the intersection of two forces colliding: American power and Chinese expansion. For years, Venezuela has been more than a failed state. It has been a strategic asset, a testing ground, a symbol. To Washington, Venezuela represented defiance in its own backyard, a regime that survived sanctions, ignored pressure, and leaned openly toward Beijing. To China, Venezuela was something else entirely, a long-term bet, a partner labeled all-weather, backed by loans, secured by oil, protected, Beijing believed, by sovereignty. Trump shattered that assumption. By removing Maduro by force, the United States wasn't just changing a government. It was challenging a principle China depends on, that investments are protected by state continuity, that contracts survive politics. That sovereignty is a shield. Once that shield breaks, nothing behind it is safe. Not debts, not oil shipments, not influence. And that is why Beijing is alarmed. Because Venezuela is not an isolated case, it may be a precedent. To understand why this confrontation became unavoidable, we need to look backward at how China quietly built its presence and why Venezuela mattered so much in the first place. For Beijing, Venezuela was never about ideology. It was about cycles. And leverage. 2 decades ago, Venezuela was rich in oil, poor in cash, isolated from Western finance. China stepped in, not with speeches, with money, loans for oil, cash for future barrels. A simple mechanism. Venezuela got liquidity, China got energy security, and political influence quietly locked in. Over time, the numbers grew. More than $100 billion in commitments, one of China's largest bets in Latin America. But the deeper logic was strategic. China was expanding south into a region long dominated by the United States. Ports, infrastructure, trade. By 2023, Beijing and Caracas called each other all-weather partners. That phrase matters. It means reliability across crises, across regimes, across pressure, and then the pressure arrived. Trump's move didn't just disrupt a government. It broke the assumption that economic cycles would outlast political ones. When power intervenes directly, history stops being gradual. It becomes abrupt, and when that happens, the first cracks always appear in money. That is where the real crisis begins. Because the moment Maduro fell, China faced a question it had tried to avoid for years. What happens when your debtor disappears? And that question exploded into a crisis almost immediately. The shock did not come slowly. It came overnight. Within hours of Maduro's capture, Beijing reacted. Not with tanks, not with threats, But with alarms, China condemned the operation, called it imperial, called it illegal, called it dangerous. Behind the language was fear, because money was now exposed. Venezuela owed China billions, not abstract numbers, real loans, real contracts backed by oil shipments still in transit. One tanker heading to China was seized, not hypothetically, physically stopped. That was the moment the crisis became real. Chinese regulators asked banks to report exposure, quietly, urgently. This was not about ideology anymore. It was about loss. If a new government puts US creditors first, Chinese banks lose. If contracts are rewritten, Chinese leverage evaporates. If debts are ignored, the precedent spreads. And precedents matter, because Venezuela is not China's only debtor. It is a test case. This is why Beijing reacted so sharply. Not because Maduro fell, but because the system protecting long-term influence suddenly looked fragile. If force can erase contracts, power outweighs patience. And once that lesson is learned, it doesn't stay in one country. It travels, which brings us to the deeper question, the one beneath the crisis. How did the system allow this to happen at all? For years, China believed it had found a formula, not dominance, but insulation. Beijing avoided military bases, avoided regime change, avoided direct confrontation. Instead, it built webs, loans tied to resources, trade tied to infrastructure, diplomacy tied to non-interference. The idea was simple. If you don't meddle in politics, politics won't touch your money. Venezuela proved how fragile that logic is, because China's system assumes continuity, that governments change slowly, that debts outlive leaders, that sovereignty protects contracts. The United States operates on a different logic. When Washington decides a regime is unacceptable, economics becomes secondary, contracts become optional, stability becomes negotiable. This is the hidden mechanism at work. China plays the long game. America plays the decisive move. And when those two systems collide, patience loses to power. That is why Beijing is alarmed. Not just because of Venezuela, but because the model itself is exposed. If non-interference cannot shield investments, what can? If oil for loans can be disrupted by force, where is safety? This is no longer a regional dispute. It is a systemic clash between two visions of order, one built on gradual influence, the other on coercive authority, and that clash was about to intensify, because the crisis did not stop with money. It moved next to something far more volatile, control. Control is where crises escalate, and this one did. Trump did not just remove a leader. He claimed authority. He said the United States would run Venezuela, not assist, not supervise. Run. That single word changed everything, because now the question was no longer who governs Caracas, it was who controls the assets. Oil became leverage, exports became pressure points, future revenue became a weapon. Washington signaled it would hold Venezuela's oil hostage. To shape the new leadership, to extract compliance, to reorder priorities, for China, this was the second shock, because oil was the collateral, the backbone of repayment, the quiet guarantee behind every loan. If the US controls the spigot, China loses its leverage. Not gradually, immediately. This is why Beijing began calculating responses. Not emotional ones, strategic ones. Could it negotiate through a proxy government? Could it restructure debt quietly? Could it use external pressure elsewhere to force compromise? The crisis accelerated. What was once a financial dispute became a contest over control of future cash flows. And when future flows are threatened, restraint disappears. Because whoever controls tomorrow controls everything that comes after. That reality pushed the crisis beyond elites and into ordinary lives. And that is where the story becomes personal. For you, this may feel distant. another country, another crisis. But this is where global power touches ordinary life. When control shifts, people pay the price first. If oil exports are frozen, salaries disappear. If debts are disputed, services collapse. If governments are reshaped from the outside, uncertainty becomes daily reality. For Venezuelans, this moment is not abstract. It means empty shelves, delayed wages, another pause on hope. And for people far beyond Venezuela, the message is unsettling. Because if sovereignty can be overridden here, it can be questioned elsewhere. If contracts can vanish overnight, stability becomes fragile everywhere. You may not live in Caracas, but you live in a world built on assumptions. That rules matter, that agreements last, that power is restrained. This crisis shakes those assumptions. It tells you that global order is thinner than it looks, that behind the language of law sits raw leverage, and that when great powers collide, individuals are caught in between. If this analysis helps you see the world with sharper eyes, remember this moment. Because understanding power is the first step to protecting yourself from its consequences. And this shock did not stay local for long. Its ripples moved outward. Fast, the ripples spread quickly, and they did not stop at Venezuela's borders. Latin America watched closely. So did Europe. So did Asia. Because this was a signal. If the United States can remove a government in its backyard, the map of influence shifts. Quietly, decisively. For China, the implications were global. Beijing has spent years expanding trade across Latin America. Ports, railways, energy deals, a record $500 billion in trade. Venezuela was a pillar in that structure. Not the largest, but one of the most symbolic. If that pillar can be knocked out, others can be pressured. Deals questioned, governments warned. This is how influence erodes, not through war, through uncertainty. Allies begin to hesitate, partners begin to hedge, neutral states reassess their bets. And the message to Beijing is unmistakable. Economic reach alone is not protection. Investment does not equal control, and distance does not guarantee safety. This moment sharpens a reality China has tried to avoid. Global power still has geography, and the United States still dominates its neighborhood. The balance has not collapsed, but it has tilted, and when balances tilt, actors start planning for what comes next. Because the future is no longer theoretical, it is approaching fast. The future now splits into paths, not predictions, scenarios. The first is accommodation. China accepts the shock, negotiates quietly, works through Caracas, not Washington. Debt is restructured. Oil revenue is shared. Losses are contained, not erased. This is the least dramatic outcome, and often the most likely. The second path is friction. China resists, uses leverage elsewhere, trade pressure, rare earth exports, diplomatic obstruction, not escalation, but strain. The system absorbs tension, but trust erodes, and every future deal carries a higher price. Then there is the third path, confrontation. China treats Venezuela as a line crossed, not militarily, but systemically. Rules are challenged, institutions are tested, retaliation spreads beyond Latin America. This is the most dangerous scenario, because once precedent becomes policy, restraint disappears. Which path emerges depends on one question. Does power still need permission? Or has the world entered a phase where force rewrites contracts and speed defeats patience? The answer will not come from speeches. It will come from behavior. And Venezuela will be remembered not for its oil, but for what it revealed about the future of order. Because systems do not collapse loudly. They shift quietly. Then suddenly, this is not the end of the story. It is the reveal. Venezuela shows us something uncomfortable. The global order we rely on is thinner than we admit. Contracts feel solid until power intervenes. Sovereignty feels absolute until it collides with force. Trump's move was shocking not because it was chaotic, but because it was effective. It reminded the world of an old truth. Power enforces rules. It does not follow them. China understands this now more clearly than before. So do every government, bank, and investor watching quietly. The lesson is not about Venezuela. It is about exposure. Who protects your interests when the system bends? Who enforces your guarantees when patience is ignored? If you want to understand the next decade of global politics, start here. With this moment, with this rupture, if this analysis helped you see the world as it really is, not as it's described, share it. Think about it. Question it. Because the next crisis will not announce itself. It will arrive quietly, like this one did. And when it does, those who understand power first will not be surprised.